This girl has been dead for 3 days. Today is the day of her burial. But suddenly, the mouth of the corpse opened. A giant butterfly crawled out from inside. The family members in the funeral hall still had no idea about the strange incident in the morgue. They only saw a large number of butterflies gathering on the rooftop. The priest had a bad feeling. It seemed like some mysterious force was approaching. He kept reciting prayers, hoping the departed would rest in peace. Then suddenly, this girl's name was Sumi. Before she passed, she was a sweet and obedient child. She had a happy family. Her father was a renowned heart surgeon. With his miraculous hands, he had saved thousands of patients. He had never failed even once. But perhaps fate had a cruel sense of humor. Sumi had a severe heart condition. When waiting was no longer an option, she had to undergo a heart transplant. Sumi's father decided to perform the surgery himself. He couldn't entrust his daughter's life to anyone else. The surgery was a great success. Sumi quickly recovered and was discharged. But just 4 months later, the poor girl lay in the cold morgue. When Sumi's father received her death certificate, he was devastated. Sumi's funeral was held at the Central Hospital Funeral Home in Seoul. According to Korean funeral traditions, the deceased must remain in the funeral home for 3 days before burial. During these 3 days, family and friends could come to pay their respects. Looking at their beautiful daughter, now only able to smile from a photograph, Sumi's parents were in unbearable pain. The funeral staff suggested that young people usually opt for a one-day ceremony. There was no need to extend it to 3 days, so the family's grief could be eased somewhat. But Sumi's grandmother disagreed. At that moment, something was wrong with Sumi's body in the morgue. The refrigeration unit had malfunctioned. The staff took this opportunity to tidy up the girl's appearance, so she could be laid to rest looking her best. But they discovered that Sumi's right hand was tightly clenched and wouldn't open. They didn't dare force her fingers open, so they called Sumi's father. Heartbroken, he gently took his daughter's hand. He softly blew on it while slowly prying her fingers apart. Inside, he found a Northern Lights bracelet. He remembered. It was the lucky bracelet he had personally put on her wrist before surgery. The more Sumi's father thought about it, the more his heart ached. Once again, he placed the bracelet back on his daughter's cold wrist. The 3-day funeral continued. At that moment, Sumi's father's colleagues from Central Hospital in Seoul also came to pay their respects. They appeared deeply saddened. But once outside, smoking, they spoke with sarcasm. They blamed Sumi's dad for always relying on his own strength to criticize others. And now, look at this. He ended up causing his own daughter's death. Guess he's learned his lesson now, huh? They even heard the nurses say that Sumi acted really strange after her surgery. Like she was paranoid or something. Some even said she was possessed. They were gossiping so eagerly, not knowing that Sumi's dad was sitting in the car nearby, hearing everything. He got so mad that he slammed the car door and left. But when he returned to the funeral, things still weren't peaceful. Sumi's classmates also came to pay their respects. According to tradition, after the visit, they had to stay for a meal. While eating, the kids started chatting about Sumi. Every week, she would bring an empty lunchbox to class, as if she was waiting for something. They even had proof that after the surgery, Sumi completely changed when she came back to school. She even pushed a boy so hard that he broke his arm and had to wear a cast. But the boy didn't blame Sumi because it felt like she was truly possessed by something. Like it wasn't actually Sumi causing trouble, but something inside her. Sumi's mom heard all of this but didn't get angry. Instead, she felt empathy. After the surgery, Sumi had even attacked her once. Her dad had to rush in and pull her away. The things Sumi screamed back then didn't sound like something a child would say. When she came to her senses, she felt deeply regretful. As if she wasn't the one who had done those things. Her whole family was really worried about her condition. In the end, they decided to ask Father Evan to perform an exorcism. Hearing his daughter's agonizing screams, Sumi's dad was heartbroken. Ignoring his family's warnings and Evan's caution, he was determined to save his daughter. He realized the door was locked from the inside, so he desperately pounded on it. Sumi's dad grabbed an axe and smashed the door open. By then, the exorcism ritual had ended. Seeing his daughter's body covered in wounds, Sumi's dad was devastated. But suddenly, Sumi started convulsing violently. Even though he tried his best to save her, she eventually lost her heartbeat and stopped breathing. She was gone. Sumi's dad was in shock, his mind completely blank. Then, he suddenly noticed drops of blood falling into his glass of wine. Looking up, he saw the ceiling was stained with deep red blood. The blood kept dripping down. At the same time, a girl who had badmouthed Sumi suddenly collapsed. She screamed, foaming at the mouth, as if she wouldn't make it. Luckily, Sumi's dad quickly performed the Heimlich maneuver, making her vomit something. And to everyone's horror, it was a fistful of hair. Meanwhile, the mortuary's freezer had finally been fixed. As the staff pushed Sumi's body inside, they suddenly heard strange knocking sounds. Then, the room's lights started flickering wildly. The white sheet covering Sumi's body suddenly moved. Terrified, the staff ran out of the morgue. That night, Sumi's family stayed overnight in the funeral hall. Sumi's dad stayed up to watch over his daughter. Half asleep, he suddenly saw Sumi standing right in front of him. She said she was really cold. Sumi's dad quickly reached out to cover her with a blanket. But right then, a dark liquid started oozing from Sumi's body. Sumi's dad jolted awake, it was just a dream. But when he put on his glasses, he realized they had cracked, just like in the dream. He stepped out of the mourning hall. Looking at the spot where Sumi had been standing, he saw frozen footprints slowly fading away. Panic set in. He rushed to the morgue. He pulled Sumi's body out of the freezer, afraid she might be cold. He took off his coat and gently covered her with it. Then he lay on the floor, holding her hand, and drifted off. But right at that moment, Sumi's eyes suddenly opened. Meanwhile, Father Evan was on his way to see the elder priest. Back home, he replayed the footage of Sumi's exorcism. The more he watched, the more he felt something was off. He had clearly expelled the demon from Sumi's body, so why did she still die? He remembered Sumi calling out the name, Burial, then mentioning, Milan. Quote. This made Evan suspect that maybe there wasn't just one demon inside her. The elder priest immediately realized how serious things had become and warned Evan to stay out of it. He would personally go to the funeral and report the situation to higher authorities. But Evan refused to back down. He remembered how his best friend had been killed by a demon. And that very same demon might now be haunting Sumi. Evan was determined to destroy it, to avenge his friend and save Sumi. The first day of the funeral passed peacefully. But on the second day, during the preparation for burial, from early morning, the farewell ceremony had begun. Sumi's family gathered around her body, crying uncontrollably. Suddenly, Sumi's dad noticed her eyes had opened. He rushed to her side and saw a single tear rolling down her cheek. No, Sumi wasn't dead. He couldn't let them bury her when there was still a chance to save her. He tried to take her to the hospital, but the others held him back. No one else had seen her open her eyes. Tears from the dead, they said, were just a normal occurrence. In the end, Sumi's dad was dragged away. Once everyone had left, a giant moth suddenly crawled out of Sumi's mouth. The funeral continued inside the mourning hall. True to his word, the elder priest arrived to perform the final rites for Sumi. But the moment he stepped in, he had a bad feeling. The air was freezing, the wind howled through the room. On the ceiling, countless moths had gathered, their numbers growing by the second. Meanwhile, Sumi's dad was still desperate to save his daughter. The priest looked around. Things were getting more dangerous by the minute. There was no time to wait. Even if Sumi's family didn't allow it, he had to perform the final rites immediately. If he delayed any longer, something terrible could happen. A bloodied hand gently brushed against the flowers in the mourning hall. Suddenly, blood started pouring from the priest's mouth. As if possessed, he slammed his head hard against the altar. His face was covered in blood, and all of his teeth fell out. Right after that, he saw a swarm of moths rushing toward him. Panicking, he waved his hands, trying to shoo them away. But the more he tried, the more they kept coming. His bloodshot eyes darted around, and suddenly, he saw Sumi standing right in front of him. Meanwhile, Evan wasn't giving up on investigating the demon that possessed Sumi. He found the name Burial in an ancient document. The legend tells of a virgin in Nazareth who suddenly became pregnant and gave birth to twins. The older one was named Bang. The younger one didn't even have a name. The demon revived through the twins' bodies. It had the power to manipulate people, making them slaughter each other and spread disaster. To stop it, ancient priests sealed the younger twin inside Burial's heart to prevent further evil. Evan rushed to the funeral home, eager to tell the priest what he had found. But he arrived just in time to see the priest, covered in blood, being thrown out. As Evan approached, the priest suddenly grabbed him with bloodshot eyes. Evan stepped into the morgue. At that moment, Sumi's body was being brought in once again. As soon as holy water was sprinkled over her, Sumi's father burst in and immediately attacked Evan. He demanded to know what Evan was doing to his daughter. But Sumi's mother gasped in horror as dark patches started appearing on Sumi's body. The marks spread rapidly across her face. Evan explained that the body was reacting to the holy water. This meant that the demon was still inside Sumi. He suspected it had something to do with the transplanted heart. They needed to find out where the heart came from. If they didn't act now, the demon would awaken inside Sumi's body. Just like Jesus, it would rise again after 3 days. But if the demon woke up, it would kill Sumi's entire family. The only way to stop it was to cremate her body immediately. If they burned the heart, they could prevent the demon from resurrecting. Sumi's father's face tensed up, his mind filled with turmoil. He knew the transplanted heart was a problem. It was an illegal heart that a colleague had secretly acquired. The heart was taken from a living person. At first, Sumi's father was furious when he found out. But when he thought about saving his daughter, he changed. To keep her alive, he heartlessly took the heart from a dying girl. Now, hearing that the heart carried a demon, he rushed to the hospital to question his colleague. The colleague admitted the heart belonged to a Russian girl who had been living illegally in Korea with her mother. They had been trapped in a fire in Izu. The colleague told Sumi's father to go to the Russian district in Izu and look for a woman called Barpuska. She might know something about the girl. Sumi's father rushed to Izu. He entered an underground Russian bar. But as soon as he asked about Barpuska, everyone became tense. Before he knew it, they knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, Sumi's father found himself tied up inside an iron cage. Standing before him was a woman, Barpuska. She was a devoted follower of a secret cult in Russia. Her ultimate goal was to resurrect a demon to escape the church's pursuit. She had sent her daughter to South Korea, using her own child's body as a vessel to bring Burial back to life. But the plan failed. The church discovered it and attempted to burn her daughter alive to prevent the demon's resurrection. So, she needed a new vessel, and Sumi was the perfect choice. She offered her daughter's heart to Sumi, sealing the demon inside. This way, Burial could return through Sumi's body. And now, as Sumi's father tried to stop her plan, she was determined to kill him, severing Sumi's last earthly tie, ensuring she would fully become Burial's vessel. Just as Babushka was about to stab Sumi's father in the chest, a voice reciting scripture echoed through the air, making her scream in pain, unable to move. It turned out Evan had found this place.
너희가 섬기는 악마 이름이 주대 도미니 에티케.
Evan kept urging Sumi's father to burn her body. But he firmly refused and drove away. Evan tried to chase after him but suddenly felt dizzy. Memories of his best friend before he died suddenly surfaced. He recalled his friend's whispered words and then saw him losing his mind. Evan had nearly been strangled to death by him. Luckily, he persisted in performing the exorcism ritual. When the demon left, his friend's life ended. Evan was gravely wounded, barely surviving. That event haunted him ever since. So when he heard the name Burial, fear and horrifying memories rushed back. It was as if he saw his old, possessed friend standing at the street corner, charging at him, ready to kill. Evan gripped his rosary tightly, chanting non-stop. Eventually, the hallucination faded. He realized it was just fear in his mind, not reality. The terrifying night finally ended. The third day had arrived, the day of Sumi's funeral. But no matter how long they waited, Sumi's father never showed up. With time running out, they had no choice but to carry her coffin out of the funeral hall. But as the 6 pallbearers began to move, they staggered and suddenly dropped the coffin. When they tried to lift it again, they realized it was unnaturally heavy. Even 6 grown men couldn't lift it. Just then, Sumi's father returned. He saw a blood-soaked figure standing beside his daughter's coffin. The coffin seemed to slide toward the corner on its own. Panicked, he rushed forward, smashing the coffin open with a fire extinguisher. Then, he grabbed his daughter's body and ran. The security guards immediately tackled him, dragging him away. Sumi's body fell to the ground. Just then, Evan arrived. He covered Sumi's eyes with a cloth and began chanting prayers. But it was too late. The sacred scriptures no longer had any effect. Right before everyone's eyes, Sumi's body suddenly floated into the air. On top of the high-rise building, a blood-covered shadow continued to manipulate her body. Then, all of a sudden, it let go. Sumi's father lunged forward, but there was nothing to catch. His daughter's body vanished into thin air. Not giving up, he began searching for her. Eventually, he reached the machine room in the basement of the central hospital. There, he saw Sumi standing in the shadows. He kept calling out her name. "Wait for me, sweetheart. I will save you," quote. The little girl said she couldn't take it anymore. And in that very moment, she disappeared into the darkness. Sumi's father rushed forward, only to see a blood-soaked shadow flash and vanish. He continued feeling his way through the darkness until he found an old, unused door. Inside, the room was filled with moths. Sumi lay on the ground, completely covered in them. He tried to rush forward to save her, but was repeatedly thrown back. At that moment, Evan found him. Sumi's father, now desperate, pleaded for his help. He was convinced that his daughter's soul was still waiting to be rescued. Evan was surprised. If Sumi's soul is still here, then maybe we can still save her. Quote. He asked Sumi's father to recite the scriptures with him for another exorcism ritual. Before they began, he warned him not to believe anything he saw or heard. The ritual started. Evan sprinkled holy water over Sumi's body. Instantly, Sumi's father saw a vision, his daughter convulsing in agony. The sight tore at his heart, almost breaking him. But he remembered Evan's warning and clenched his teeth, fighting back his emotions. The scriptures continued to echo through the room. At last, Sumi's father overcame the illusion. But right away, the demon unleashed even more terrifying tricks. He realized that the scripture book in his hands had turned completely blank. The surroundings started to shift. He found himself in a morgue. Frantically, he opened every drawer, searching for Sumi. But instead, he was met with a blood-drenched female demon. The scene changed again. Sumi's father was now tied down on an operating table. His wife and colleagues surrounded him, preparing to cut out his heart. He could even hear the heart monitor flatlining. Sumi's father was on the verge of breaking. But Evan's voice snapped him back to reality. Then, another illusion took over. He saw that Evan was not a priest, but the demon trying to kill his daughter. Enraged, he grabbed a scalpel and pinned Evan down, ready to stab him in the heart. But even as he was restrained, Evan kept chanting. At that moment, Sumi's soul suddenly rushed forward and embraced her father. The little girl whispered his name. And in that moment, Sumi's father snapped back to reality. Evan narrowly escaped death. The exorcism was reaching its final stage, it was almost over. Evan didn't hesitate, he moved straight to the most crucial step. Calling out the demon's true name to banish it from Sumi's body. But just as he was about to do it, Evan suddenly collapsed. Only one final step remained. Panicked, Sumi's father desperately asked his daughter how he could save her. Suddenly, Sumi's spirit appeared, holding a knife to his throat. She accused him of being a coward. To save me, you stabbed an innocent girl in the chest and stole her heart, knowing it was illegal. Quote. Sumi's father admitted his sins. He accepted his fate, he was willing to trade his life for Sumi's. Without hesitation, he leaned forward, allowing the blade to pierce his heart. In that instant, the dark markings on Sumi's body began to fade. Instead, they slowly spread onto her father's face. By the time Sumi's mother found her, the girl's heartbeat and breathing had returned. Her body was even starting to feel warm again. The doctors immediately rushed Sumi into the emergency room. Within a short time, all of her vital signs returned to normal. Evan, who was severely injured, was also taken to emergency care. But when he regained consciousness, he was startled to see a moth perched on the window. He instinctively followed it to the hospital rooftop. There, Sumi's father stood, dazed. From a distance, Evan realized the horrifying truth. Because of the deal he made, Sumi's father had been possessed, allowing Sumi to come back to life. But the demon would now control him, forcing him to kill his own family. That was why Sumi had tried to strangle her mother. Now, his mind was overwhelmed with violent urges. He knew he was on the verge of losing himself completely. But he couldn't let the demon win. Evan wanted to help him perform an exorcism, but Sumi's father refused to drag anyone else into this. He didn't die right away. Instead, he took out a lighter and set fire to a gasoline-leaking car. He intended to burn himself along with the demon. Sumi's father perished, but his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Sumi fully recovered, returning to her normal life and going back to school. One day, she, her mother, and her younger brother visited her father's grave. For the rest of her life, she would never forget that her father gave up everything to save her. She was also grateful to Evan for giving her a second chance at life. At first glance, this movie seems like a ghost story. But in reality, the true demon came from within the father himself. The moment he held a scalpel and took the heart of a living Russian girl to save his daughter. That was when he became the monster. Trading one child's life for another. No matter how much love a father has, such an act can never be forgiven. Perhaps deep down, Sumi's father had always known the demon was inside him. That's why he kept resisting Evan's exorcism. Only when he faced the demon within himself and accepted his punishment could he be redeemed. And bring Sumi back to life. Thank you for watching.